Greetings, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Liberty Dispatch Interviews. Today, we have a special guest we are pleased to have with us on LDI, Dr. P. Andrew Sandlin. Dr. Sandlin is the founder and president of the Center for Cultural Leadership. He's also faculty of the Ezra Institute's Runner Academy and the distinguished visiting professor of cultural theology of Edinburgh Theological Seminary. He founded CCL in 2001 with the conviction that only eminently equipped Christian leaders will actually create a new Christian culture, and that only transformed Christians can transform the present anti-Christian culture of the West. He holds a BA in English, History, and Political Science. He was awarded an MA in English Literature. He's taken doctoral work in English, and he holds a doctorate in Sacred Theology. He's married and has 5 adult children and 4 grandchildren. He takes Dominion very seriously. Doc Sandlin, thank you for joining us on Liberty Dispatch Interviews. It's great to have you.
Thank you, Matthew and Andrew. It's a privilege to be here with you guys. Appreciate what you're doing.
Yeah, well, we're so excited to have you on, Andrew. I keep every time you go through the bios of our guests, I'm kind of who are we to be having such powerful discussions with such prestigious men? But
we should add our own bio, and with him are Andrew and Matt. They have nice beards,
guys. And, just a couple of dudes.
That's it.
yeah, that's it. Yeah, that's it. Good to talk to you, Doc.
Sandlin, there were some particularly important things that we wanted to have you on specifically to discuss. We're in a position right now in Canada where the necessity of having to build a Christian culture and the utter collapse of our Christian moorings in Canada, a once thoroughly and completely Christian nation in its founding documents, in the Fathers of Confederation, in even our coat of arms, the passages of Scripture that blazon the buildings in Parliament. So that was Canada, and we've essentially excised all of the rich Christian heritage from our nation, and now we're trying to make sense of what the rebuilding process looks like. So we wanted to have you on to talk about issues related to that. I guess the first thing that we wanted to ask is, when we have this discussion, people use the word state, some as it pertains primarily to the civil structures, the civil magistrate, or state regarding a nation or nation. And so I guess the first question is, how would you define biblically what a state is? And is that different? And if it is, how so, then how we would define a nation in similar terms?
Yeah, that's a great question. They certainly are different, related, of course, but different. A state is essentially a jurisdiction over which an authority or a group of authorities have coercive rule in external matters of life. It's not in particular an ancient idea, although we can, as we look backward, we can see what we would today call a state. But the key elements there is a jurisdiction, and that includes a physical jurisdiction, which means borders, or at least something approaching borders, a hot topic, as you well know, today. But also the word coercive. That's a key. The state is the only sphere. We'll get into sphere sovereignty perhaps later, but it's the only divinely established sphere that has the authority of coercion. Also, parents do to a degree with minor children, but that, of course, is very different from the coerciveness of the state. Now, when we get to the term nation, the answer is a lot more complex, and we don't have time to go into the details, but do we mean nation in the modern sense of the nation state? Or do we mean nation as it's been understood mostly historically before the rise of the modern nation state? Or do we mean the biblical idea of nation? The biblical idea is probably the simplest. Originally, it was essentially what we would call a tribe, and this was true all over the ancient world. And as they grew and grew and grew, they didn't become what we would call today a state or a nation state. There were sort of tribes, and then there were empires. And in fact, a lot of the nations at the time, you read in the Old Testament, Israel's enemies in Canaan, the nation of the Canaanites, Hivites, Hittites, and so on, were not much bigger than towns towns today. So a nation can exist and often does exist within the jurisdiction of a state, but those two are by no means identical. A real problem arises when you try to identify a nation too closely with a particular race or ethnicity. And that's happened historically a lot. In fact, probably most of the time historically, that's been the case. That's not specifically the biblical idea of the state, and it's certainly not the Western idea as it was influenced by Christianity, whether it's Canada, United States, or most of Western Europe. United States and Canada, for example, have a number of races and what we call races and ethnicities. In the Bible, the key to a Christian state and a Christian nation is not ethnicity, but religion. So the issue is not the color of the skin or any such thing like that, or any racial heritage, but what is your relationship to God, the triune God and Jesus Christ? So that's kind of a quick answer and a lot of stuff thrown at one time, but that kind of is the distinction between state and nation.
That's really helpful to distinguish between the two. So now, if we're understanding nations, Andrew, you said, okay, well, it's not specifically ethnic. So you talked about how nations grew out of tribes. Is it best to understand them? I've definitely heard a lot of people who are kind of on the dank right, as Doug Wilson calls them, a lot of the more magisterial kind of Christendom 1.0 type of guys who want to go back to that kind of magisterial sacral state. They've kind of defined, and they've used this term, that essentially the state or nations are just the family writ large. And that's a question that I've been having bounce around my head. To me, that seems to miss the point. I see how, given the fact that many nations grow out of tribes and some of those natural, affections, we could think that way. Or is biblically it better to understand nations or states covenantally rather than as far as like ethnicity, like you're talking about? So help us maybe make a distinction there. Is essentially the state nothing but a really, really big family? Or is there some sort of distinction that we have to understand that would disprove that? And then if it's not based on ethnicity and people and place, what nations and states are, how do we actually define that biblically?
Well, it's not a family writ large, so it's understandable why someone might come to that conclusion, because, of course, originally, when there were relatively fewer people on the earth, what we, looking backward, would call the state obviously had to involve the families, because that's all there were. I think Herman Dooyeweerd says it very well, that over time there is the differentiation of these spheres. Incidentally, the same would be true of the church. Certainly the church in the Old Testament largely was a family or collection of families. But over time, after more and more people reproduce, then the important thing is not the family per se. It has its own separate sphere, but also the development of the sphere of the state, which is defined, as I said earlier, the coercive authority within a particular physical jurisdiction over matters that are external matters, the external moral law of God, as Christians we would say. So we do, of course, have today a number of people, a particular classification of people who believe that the state is the family writ large. And we have had them a number of times in the 20th century, and they tend to be totalitarian dictatorships. That's exactly what Adolf Hitler believed. That's exactly what Mussolini believed, to an extent less so Franco in Spain, and of course Hirohito in Japan, and these sort of dynastic empires. Their view is, even though it's not technically one family or an extension of race, nonetheless, you look at everybody there as being a member of the family, and the head of the nation, the head of the state, is sort of the father or the daddy. That's very dangerous. The more biblical approach, the Protestant approach, which I believe is the biblical approach, is seeing the role of the state as authorized to enforce the moral law of God appropriate to that sphere, that is appropriate to the coercive sphere, a sphere. By the spear, I could say, the sphere by the spear, coercively. So that is the role of the state, and that is the only role of the state. And if we ask the state to do something else, if they ask the state to educate people or make people more religious or convert people, we are extending beyond and are transgressing the biblical limits of the state. And that's very dangerous. It's dangerous whether it's done by Marxists or socialists or even Christians. Well-meaning Christians have done it. Some people would say that's what happened. Your language, of course, Christendom 1.0. There was a lot of that, well-meaning, but it was a mistake. And that's why I think we have sphere sovereignty. I guess I can delve into that if it's all right, guys, just quickly.
Yes, please. That's the distinction I was wanting you to make, I think, as far as how we're best to think about this. So please do.
Yeah. That's not, of course, that's just a heuristic. That is a means of teaching. It's not biblical language per se, but it's describing a biblical phenomenon, and that is that God has established various spheres. God doesn't generally come down and exercise his authority directly. He can do that, but he doesn't. He authorizes man, starting, of course, Genesis, the cultural mandate. But he doesn't do it in a monistic way. He divides authority between jurisdictions. So in a fallen world, we have the family, which is its own separate sphere, its own authority, its own regulations. And the state is its own separate sphere, its own authority, its own uniqueness, its own regulations. The same is true of the church. And now in a subordinate sense, we could even add education and schools, and we could even say the artistic community. They've each got their own separate responsibilities. Now, in a Christian society, then these all work together, but they don't transgress the bounds. The church cannot become a state. The church cannot act coercively. It has the power of the keys. It does not have the power of the sword, to use biblical and traditional language. And the family is not the church. We sometimes speak of house churches. Well, that's fine for a church to meet in a home. But in the Bible, the church isn't, well, the daddy who's the pastor and the mommy who's the assistant pastor and the kiddies who are the members. It's obviously not that. So each of these has its own separate role. Anytime you have a transgression of these bounds of sphere sovereignty, you run the danger of tyranny. In the medieval world, in many cases, the church itself, the Roman Catholic Church, overstepped its bounds and sometimes almost took to itself the authority of the state. Not technically in most cases, but this is the language, of course, that James White uses speaking of sacralism. That's what he's largely talking about. And it certainly was a danger. Now, that isn't to say that the state is to be secular and the state's not religious. The state is inherently religious, but the state's not the church. It has a Christian responsibility, but it has a particular kind of Christian responsibility. And the same is true of the family, and the same is true of the church. So sphere sovereignty doesn't solve every single problem. We live in a fallen world, but it does solve many of the problems that we're talking about. I think today, one of the things that's absolutely necessary is a recovery of sphere sovereignty. Our forefathers in the United States, and I dare say also Canada, even though they may not have used this language, they understood this. And that's why we have checks and balances on power, for one thing. But this loss of sphere sovereignty is a very dangerous thing.
Andrew, before you ask a question, I just want to, you mentioned the roles of the different spheres, Andrew. Can you just give us a really quick overview of what are the various roles? What's the various authorities given to these different jurisdictions that you're talking about, whether it be family, church, or state?
Yeah, let's talk with the basic and the only creational one, of course, and that's the family. Biblically, if you look in Genesis 1 and 2 and other scriptures, you see that the role of the family and leading to that, mankind in general, is exercising dominion in the earth. God bringing the man and the woman together to bear children. That is a creational norm. And that's why, and I won't go too far afield here, that every husband or wife that get married should try to have children and have children, if at all possible. So to bear children. and also to bring them up in the nurture and admonition of the Lord, to husbands and wives to love one another, sacrifice for one another, and essentially to perpetuate the race, and also to perpetuate true religion, the true Christian faith within the realm of the family. That's the family's responsibility. It's the most basic of all of these spheres, though certainly not the only one. And then, of course, after the fall, we have the church. The responsibility of the church is to preach the word of God and to preserve right belief. We would say today Christian orthodoxy, and it has a monopoly on the sacraments, or some call them the ordinances. It's not the responsibility of the family to create its own orthodoxy. A Christian dad can't say, I don't like the Apostles' or Nicene Creed, so I'm going to make up my own. I'm sorry, he doesn't have the authority to do that. The church does. So that's largely responsibility of the church, the center of gospel preaching, and edifying the saints together, meeting together for public worship. That isn't to say that families don't have worship, they do too. But this idea of public worship under the authority of elders, church leaders, that's the monopoly of the church. That's not given to the state. The role of the state, excuse me, I'm getting over a little sickness. The responsibility of the state is to exercise and impose God's moral law appropriate to that sphere. When I say that, I say, and people misunderstand, they say, a Christian view of the state means you need to make people better Christians. That's not the idea of a Christian state. That's the responsibility of families and churches and subsidiary ministries and organizations. The responsibility of the state is most Christian when it does what the Bible tells it to do, and that is to enforce the law of God appropriate to its sphere, to protect, if you want to use American language, life, liberty, and property, to suppress murder, rape, pillage, and all sorts of other kidnapping, all sorts of other things, and grotesque sexual evils and so on. These particular external evils. It's not the responsibility of the state to see what people's hearts are like, to suppress covetousness or prayerlessness or anything like that. There are specific external evils defined by the law of God. The important thing there to understand is that all crimes are sins, but most sins are not crimes. Mm-hmm. So it's important to distinguish those.
Yeah, very good.
So I was having a conversation with a friend earlier today. He's a pastor in Ontario. He's a solid brother, kind of very engaged in the political sphere. And we were talking about this weird phenomena that is, I think, a more modern phenomena. I don't think that our forefathers in the faith coming out of the Reformation and the Puritans and the founding of Canada and the United States failed in this way, the same way that we do, which is this distinction that is to say that Christians, and primarily pastors, are and should never consider running for any sort of political or elected office, and should really be hands off in the politics realm. So that distinction is, I think that it clearly exists in the culture. And I would argue, as I think you've made the point, that that's one of the reasons why we see godlessness increasing in the state, because you're not supposed to have the separation of God and state, but you're not supposed to have a state church. So I guess the question that I have for you is, can you pinpoint, or can you, I guess, speak to where historically, where we started to see this removal, if you will, or this disengagement from political, cultural, where Christians and churches, by and large, started saying, we're not going to do that anymore. We're not going to do politics. We're not going to encourage it. We're not going to get people to run for office. We're not going to speak about politics. We're just going to worry about the church and the gospel, and, kind of heightened by the Together for the Gospel, TGC idea. When did that decoupling of pastors, churches, Christians thoroughly engaged in the political sphere, understanding that we need to have righteous laws and righteous lawmakers, when did that start to fall apart? Maybe if you could, primarily in the United States, it's probably similar in Canada, but when do we see that happening in North America?
Yeah, that's a very perceptive and important question. I think, in my view, this is largely, not exclusively, but largely the result of a union between late 18th century, early 19th century pietism and revivalism. These were essentially ideas, and they had roots earlier. I don't want to go into detail there. That the responsibility of the church and the Christian family is largely an internalized and vertical faith, one's personal relationship to God. And the only horizontal relation is going to church itself or evangelizing and so on. And this is often attached to and driven by a deep sense of emotion and very clear external conversion experiences and so on. And there was the notion that what we call politics, this isn't so much language that was used at the time, the term politics certainly was, and the role of the state, that was not terribly a sort of a Christian concern. Now, of course, the Anabaptists, excuse me again, historically, and other sort of radical reformers had believed this a long time. But this began to enter the evangelical and even the Reformation churches as a result of a pietistic and revivalistic approach to things. So you don't see it as much even in the 18th century. The Enlightenment, even though there were seeds of it there because of rationalism, but really within this notion largely did not begin outside the church. That's the point I want to make. Basically, the church surrendered its responsibility, its notion of applying the faith in all of life, the notion that Christians should be involved in politics. Incidentally, in the American founding, there have been wonderful books. Alice Baldwin wrote a great book on this about sermons and the Presbyterianism and the American founding. I should say not just Presbyterians, but certainly them, the big influence, the Christian influence in the American founding. And you men will know more about Canada, but you're absolutely right. From my study, Canada, there's a Christian commonwealth, essentially, like the United States and in the U.S., the various states. But I think it's largely that pietistic and revivalistic withdrawal. And it continued throughout the 19th century, and certainly in the U.S. after the Civil War, it accelerated. At that time, it sort of worked in tandem with other factors, like, if I may say so, a severe theological deviation called dispensationalism, which we inherited from Darby, J.N.D. Darby in England, Schofield in the United States. And then that's on the Christian side. Then on the secular side, of course, increasing growth in the 19th century of Darwinism and secularism and humanistic secular democracy. And after the Civil War, it really accelerated. But I would say particularly after World War I in the U.S. So the short answer to your question, guys, is this wasn't the case of a secular society sort of coming in and bullying the church and keeping it out of politics. It was more that the church surrendered its responsibility to apply the faith and culture under the guise of a sort of a deeper spirituality.
Yeah.
And I want to be a biblical Calvinist reformational thinker, and I, of course, oppose that. The faith should apply in all of life. That is not, as you guys wisely said, that is not to say there should be a union of church and state, or that the church itself the state itself should impose some kind of impose the faith on people. But it is responsible. The state has Christian responsibility, and that's where it's failed.
Yeah, and that gets me into a question that I want to ask, because you made a provocative statement that we didn't go down that rabbit hole, but I think to many of our listeners, they might be like, whoa, what are you saying there, Dr. Sandlin? You said the state is necessarily religious, and I think this kind of highlights the absurdity of Christians hunkering down in our religious bunkers and not influencing culture or not influencing politics, because it's fundamentally misunderstanding the religious root of all of life. So you're the president of the Center for Cultural Leadership. You talk much about religion is the root of culture and politics. Maybe help for our people who maybe have never heard anybody state the state is necessarily religious. What do you mean by that? That to a lot of people is an absurdity, but it is fundamentally true. So I want you to kind of delve into what you mean by that.
Yes, well, every human institution, and in fact, every act of humanity is inescapably religious because man is created in the image of God. Even the most depraved and sinful man who's turned away from God is nonetheless religious. He is an apostate, that is, he has turned away from God. Religion comes from, well, for one thing, the Latin religio, meaning to bind. It means to bind to God, or pagan, the gods. So people say, Christianity is a relationship. It's not a religion. Well, that's false. Christianity absolutely is a religion. It's a religion in the Bible, and everything in life is religious. Well, what has happened is because over the last 100 years in the U.S., probably Canada too, there's been a march away from Christianity. Secularists would say, well, we can get out of this influence of Christianity by saying we need to get the state out of the religion business. What they were really saying, and they would never acknowledge this, is we want the state to give up its orientation to and commitment to Christianity in order that it can embrace another religion. And that religion has been largely a secularism and humanism, and really a union of two, secular humanism. So today's Justin Trudeau's view of the state, his political philosophy is a profoundly religious philosophy. It is influenced by secularism. He is a softcore Marxist, for example, obviously a leftist. We use the term secular as though it means non-religious, but it's not. Secularism is a particular form of religion. It is a particular view of God, a particular view of reality, a particular view of life, a particular worldview. All of this is inescapably religious. So for somebody to say, well, I think we need to separate religion from the state, that's an impossibility. Every state is a religious establishment. Every church is a religious establishment, even the bad ones. That's the problem. You see, that's the problem with secular states, is that they are very religious. Now, I'm not an expert on Justin Trudeau, thank the Lord, but think about him for a minute.
Wants that. Even
Nobody
his
wants
biographers
that.
will be like, "Oh, I can't do this anymore."
No.
Whenever we play a video clip of Justin Trudeau on our show, we give
like a 3-minute warning.
an ample warning, and we'll let people know. Put on a helmet, don't operate heavy machinery. If you're prone to seizures, sit down. We'll make sure to let people know you have been amply warned.
All necessary. All necessary.
Yes, and justifiably so. When I do here in the U.S. hear clips of him, I think, oh well, that's in most of what he says. It's a deeply religious man. People to say, well, he's not religious. No, he's profoundly religious. He has a zeal. You hear him talk when he's supporting various, what he said on whether it's transgender issues, or whether it's during COVID and all that. He was driven. He is a driven man. He has deep religious presuppositions. They're perverted ones, but what we can't say is, well, he's not religious. He's coolly, calmly secular. He's certainly not that. And of course, neither was Joe Biden, and neither is President Trump. No one can be. So the state is an inherently and inescapably religious institution. By the way, no less religious than the church, just religious perhaps in a different expression, but nonetheless religious.
Yes.
And this is the frustration when dealing with libertarians. People who try to make the claim that no, the state is a-religious and has no business. Just having to hear libertarians say that it is never the job of the state to legislate some form of morality, but rather to be amoral and just let it do its thing. But they can't understand when they're so deeply entrenched in that libertarian worldview. They can't understand, or they reject, I think, what Calvin rightly affirms, is that the heart is a perpetual forge of idols, and we've been made to worship and serve something. And so when people come together in institutions or in a civil magistrate, they can't stop being people that are made to worship and serve something. That you can't just turn that off until you're dead. and even then, you still don't turn it off.
Andrew, I'm just wondering. So, I'm sure we have some libertarians listening to this program because we're part of the freedom movement in Canada. Maybe they're, their hackles are up. They're a little bit offended at the fact that you would call them out like that. Doc Sandlin, do you think that what they're worried about, a friend of ours like Bruce Party, what he's worried about is when he says you shouldn't legislate morality, he's actually properly... he's worried about the thing that you've already talked about, Dr. Sandlin, where the state from a biblical perspective is not a-religious, but it's not supposed to coerce internal thought life or spiritual convictions or religious convictions, stuff like that. Do you think that's what they're worried about when they're saying, well, we shouldn't legislate morality, but they're kind of fundamentally missing that necessary distinction that it's not whether, it's which religion, right? The inescapable concept that Rushdoony talks about. Is that a distinction that people often trip over in your mind?
Yeah. Yeah, of course, I think some of them just want free dope and free sex. I mean, that's the that's the libertarian. But a lot of them, it's the thing about libertarianism, this alleged irreligious libertarianism. It's so utterly inconsistent. Every libertarian you talk to believes very strongly in the preservation of property rights, and we would, of course, support them in that. But you would ask yourself why, and they would say, "Well, that's just sort of inherent in human nature that property is an extension of the person, or whatever." And we would say, "Well, why?" Well, that's just the way it is. But you can't answer that's just the way it is. There have a Marxist, and there are smart Marxists, perverse but smart, would say, well, why should that be the case? I mean, we all live together here in a society. Shouldn't we all sort of share in this because we all need each other? Now, I, as a Christian, have a good argument to that, but I don't see how a libertarian who has no basis, no authoritative basis for answering that, how is he going to respond to that? Well, he'll only respond by giving a religious answer, which is there is something about humanity, something about the dignity of the individual that would demand the protection of private property. Unless they're total anarchists, and there are almost none of them are total anarchists, they'll say, yeah, absolute minimal state, and the state protects contracts and enforces contracts and protects against theft. Well, what you're saying is there's a religious view of the state then. Why would you do that? Why would it be illegal for me to come into your house with a gun and steal all your money? Why would that be wrong? Well, if you answer that question well, then you're giving a religious answer. So libertarianism, like a lot of views, wants to borrow Christian premises and then sort of kick Christianity out the front door after it smuggled Christianity in the back door. So it's an inconsistent,
and I think, Dr. Glenn Sunshine has really done a great job at kind of tracing the roots of, you laid out the three basic rights, right? Life, liberty, property. Well, they come from Christianity, especially as the medieval canonists are working that out throughout history. That's how they develop. So even they're trying to grab the things that come out of the law of God, come out of the authoritative word of God inscripturated for us, and then try and jettison that actually that foundation. But you can't do it because this, again, an inescapable concept. It's not whether, it's which. It's states are necessarily religious. It's what it. So the question isn't whether you're going to have a theocracy. Essentially, it's which theocracy you're going to have. And when we talk about making Canada great again, a lot of that is not doing something that's never been done in Canada. It's actually returning to the foundation of our legal system, right? In our preamble, what do we give lip service to, now sadly in vain? It's the supremacy of God, the God of the triune God of Scripture, and the rule of higher law. those have historical meanings. Those mean something. And that's where our forefathers understood something that we don't understand, that the authority of law is necessarily religious. So if you're going to have an authoritative law that's going to bind a nation together, it must have that religious root. So I think that's why it's so important for us to get this concept. And I know we talk a lot about it on the show, Andrew, but I think this is what a lot of people often miss in conversations about politics and state, is that religious root. So I think it's important for us to hammer it home. Andrew, you got a question?
Well, we actually want to talk to Doc Sandlin a little bit more, and we want to talk about the fact that we might be fellow countrymen soon enough, sooner as opposed to later, which would, I mean, in some ways, the idea of being able to concealed carry would be phenomenal. I think that's the biggest pro, and maybe some
lower
tax relief.
taxes. Yeah.
So we definitely want to talk about that. We want to talk about President Trump and our soon-to-be governor of the 51st state of the United States. But if you
we might
want
talk
to,
a little bit of liberalism and post-war consensus for some who are interested in that too.
If you want to catch that portion of the interview, then you're going to have to head over to ldcanada.substack.com. You're going to have to become a subscriber, a paid subscriber, monthly or annually. It's $10 a month, $100 a year, and then you can catch the rest of this interview, which, if you've enjoyed this, and I'm sure you have, and if you haven't, then you definitely want to catch the rest of this, because something's wrong. You need to learn more and develop and grow and be sanctified. So head over to ldcanada.substack.com, become a paid subscriber, and then come and join us for the rest of the interview with Dr. Andrew Sandlin. Liberty Dispatch has been brought to you by SDG Media. If you want to stay in touch with us and all things Liberty Dispatch, join our email list, or support the show, head over to ldcanada.substack.com.